Mandem is an online platform for young men of colour to express themselves. I was inspired by things like SBTV and Link Up TV, and like in a lot of ways they are giving a platform for young men of colour, particularly in music.
Mandem gives us a space to do what we do as artists. If we're writers, filmmakers, photographers, it gives us a space where we can be judged on our work, not the colour of our skin. That barrier is broken down.
The actual events where discussions are held and it's real people sort of engaging with these issues and topics, that's when people can really take something home because they've been involved.
We can create masculinity how we want it to be. We don't have to be hyper masculine. We don't have to be aggressive in a way of our mannerisms and our artistic prowess. We can just be ourselves. So I think that's the most important thing, allowing to create our own space and allowing to be who we are instead of being a stereotype.
No! The world must be people's!
Hello, Adom. How are you doing today? Are you well?
I'm good, thank you, Elias. Very good. It's nice to see you again. The sun is shining outside in Bristol where I am, so yeah, can't complain.
Good to see you too, man. So I've been asked to do this discussion with the Barbican, and I'm really excited because I know you're very knowledgeable on the area of masculinity and fatherhood, and we always have interesting and exciting discussions about this stuff. I think it's great that we can still include you in that Mandem Don't Cry discussion as an after effect, which is really cool. And you did get to have a little watch of the discussion, didn't you?
Yeah, it was a powerful discussion. I was sad not to be there. It was you guys put on a brilliant event as ever. But the one thing that really struck me as I was watching was how you were able to assemble an eclectic set of voices that were able to speak to the kind of the many and diverse experiences of masculinity, working out as we all are what it means to be a man and how we relate to our own sense of what maleness is, and the various different ways that the guys on the panel were positioned, but being able to come together and have what was a rich and quite profound conversation, not just about music and art, but also how they're situated as young men on a journey of their own in relation to these various different kind of pushes and pulls of masculinity, and how, like, in the midst of that, also being able to kind of really be able to get to the ground of, and the kind of in an honest way, the kind of an authentic sense for themselves of what it means to be a man. And I think that is most powerful. Often I think we're positioning ourselves in relation to received kind of notions of what we feel masculinity is or should be, to, like I said, kind of push and pull us in different directions. So be able to assert your own kind of sense of masculinity, I think, is really important.
Something that really kind of resonated with me or stuck out to me was when Vince mentioned those two songs literally saving his life.
In terms of this particular conversation, I can literally go back to the moment where I heard two tunes that I feel saved my life. So that was Brand New Day by Dizzy Rascal and Everything Happens for a Reason by Wiley. So for me, when I heard those tunes at that time, it was made very clear to me that I was a part of something, but that I was allowed to define it. So in Dizzy Rascal's tune, Brand New Day, the chorus is, pay money, pay respect, don't insult my intellect.
And I thought that was really interesting because there's been all this debate, and one of the sort of premises of this discussion was this ongoing debate about music and violence and the kind of proliferation of drill music. And I thought it was a really interesting statement because we are in a situation where, music for some of these young black men is literally saving their life, right? So one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask you was, is there almost a need to come to terms with the middle ground regarding the fine line between rap music sort of both preventing violence and promoting violence, if that makes any sense.
I think so much about, so I'm gonna get at this via masculinity. I think so much of masculinity is about negotiating, balancing, and sitting with contradictions between the versions of ourselves which we might see or which are told to us, our experiences, and weighing those, and then also between what we think we should be doing, our ideals, and how we actually live. And so there's these constant kind of play, or this constant balancing act, this constant kind of negotiation, that might never get resolved, and that the resolution is to be able to sit with those contradictions. And I think that art, in a sense, we know in many different ways attempts to reflect life, but it also unlocks the imagination as well. And I think without imagination, we're like, our lives can be quite kind of dull and pretty empty. And I think sometimes in these discussions of whether or not particular kinds of music, specifically particular kinds of urban Black music, whether they promote violence, in many ways are probably getting at the question from the wrong angle. Like, more than anything, my question would be more exploratory. It would be to ask, well, what do our musical productions offer us, and what do they offer the makers of that music? Both the listener, when I say us, I mean the listener, and the maker of that music. What does it bring you? What does it enable? What kinds of flights of the imagination become possible by reconstructing a horrible scene which you might have heard about, or a story that you might have heard about, through the kind of the almost like an eloquent kind of wordplay of like all related to like culinary skill, yeah? So about like chefing and cooking and all these kind of like interesting different ways that wordplay is used to describe quite a kind of like a violent set of interactions. I'm okay to sit with the contradiction of that. On the one hand, there's an incredible violence that it's almost describing, or that it might be seen to be, that a set of lyrics or a track might be seen to be promoting. And this is about, I'm alluding now to the kind of moral panic around drill music. But also I can sit with the kind of the beauty of the wordplay, and I can genuinely see it as like a powerful kind of poetry. Do you know what I mean?
There's never been an escape from this, code trapping for a reason. Testing times, taxed by a system you don't believe in. Big pardon and hold your grievance. You ever had to sleep through the sound of your mother grieving? These smiles could be so deceiving. We don't need another leader. We don't need another teacher. Need it all in an instant. And school makes you feel useless, but you could flip a gram without the test to prove it. And the boxes command 10 out of 10. But you already made a promise to never do that again. Cause your brother went from an 8 to a life in a pen. Lord of mercy upon the soul of a sinner. I've been dining with killers. Blood of Jesus in my liver. Hell's fire in my tongue. Head spinning, stress, pains in my lung, no guidance, just cycles of senseless violence. There's no winners on the road life, and prison systems look at black youths like a gold mine. Youngers getting feisty, grafting, just to take J back to JD. It don't make sense. Trappers in the gallows till she trapping with a baby.
Yeah, music is escapism, and yeah, it's so important that society looks at these things, accounting for the nuances and whatnot. But yeah, man, it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about, for those who don't know, about your decision to choose to study in Dominica and make masculinity and fatherhood and kinship your kind of focus of research. So do you maybe want to talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist by training and by profession. So for anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's the equivalent to a sociologist effectively, but historically anthropologists worked in far-flung places around the world, like so-called exotic places, with predominantly non-white populations, predominantly often indigenous populations, to whichever areas they were working in. And then sociologists would be the ones who did the research at home, so to speak. Obviously, there's quite a kind of a Western kind of way of considering things, is that anthropologists worked in the so-called non-West, and then putting it quite simply, sociologists worked in Western industrialized countries. Nowadays, the lines are much more blurred between the two, And it used to be that anthropologists were kind of a archetypical white man, bourgeois white man, who would go off and study a tribe in a place and find out their customs and their way of life and immerse themselves in the way of life of that group. Now, anthropology has transformed quite a bit since that time. Now they let people like me in who have complex relationships to their ancestral homes, and some of us choose to do research in those places. So my grandparents so I'm mixed. My grandparents on my mother's side are from a small island in the Caribbean called Dominica, that's situated between Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Lesser Antilles, the small string of islands below Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and so on, made up of places like St. Lucia, places like St. Vincent, Grenada, these kind of places. So my grandparents came to the UK in the 1950s, and interestingly, they came from the Caribbean, but they found work in factories that processed various kinds of goods that were coming from across the empire and across the Atlantic. So my grandmother worked for a short time in a cigarette factory, and my grandfather worked for many years in Cadbury's chocolate factory. And my grandfather retired back to the Caribbean. He left the UK before I was born. And so I never really got a chance to know him. And as I went through my undergraduate studies of learning about these different cultures around the world, I developed a bit of an interest in the Caribbean. And I was really also at the same time kind of becoming more and more interested in my family. And at the time when I graduated, my cousin, who's got the same birthday as me, had a little boy who's my godson. And he was facing various different challenges in terms of how he was being perceived as a father before he even had the experience of working out what fatherhood had meant for him, from pretty much from the beginning. And I was realizing that a lot of the the stereotypes, the assumptions about how he was being framed as a father by the prospective mother of his kid, who was a white woman, or who still is a white woman. She had a certain idea maybe of Black masculinity, of the father he was going to become. And he wasn't even able to have a kind of a say in that. And the more I read about it, and often when I'm kind of struck by something like this, I'll start reading about it and think about, well, where do these ideas, where do these images come from? And I was able to trace a lot of the stereotypes around so-called absent Black fatherhood back to the plantation, and this notion that the plantation was a space where the Black father was essentially kind of symbolically dispossessed or taken away from his role as a father and being considered fundamentally a laborer. And then all of the kind of authority of the Western ideal of the father became invested in the plantation owner, the slave master, if you will. And I wanted to actually dispel that as a myth. I wanted to look beneath the surface to find out in what ways men, Black men specifically, were able to enact fatherhood even against the odds in these kinds of circumstances, and make fatherhood on their own terms, rather than being considered always absent, roving, dispossessed, separate from female-centered households.
Cool. Well, maybe that's a pretty good segue into some of the questions that were sent in, and there was a very sweet one sent in from an Eprom, 7 years old. What do you think about having children as a man? I can't answer that one, unfortunately, just yet.
I had some notes that I'd written up in response to it, but I think it's better to just come off the dome with that one. Yeah, we were saying before that sometimes the most straightforward questions are sometimes the most powerful. What do I think of having children as a man? Wow, like it changes, it reorders your world to some degree, and that sounds kind of cliched, but it makes you examine what your priorities are and what you think is important, and that doesn't necessarily happen immediately. It might take a while, but it forces you to, if you take that role seriously, then it forces you to get to the foundations of kind of who you are and what you think is important. And also it teaches you patience, and it teaches you humility. Like if you think your child is going to do exactly what you want them to, then you're sorely mistaken. So you have to learn to be flexible. And that's a hard one for me, because it's almost like, for some reason, I seem to assume that my baby would come out or our little girl would come out like fully like knowing like how to do certain things, like what's right and what's wrong. Yes, you shouldn't put your finger in that plug. Yes, you shouldn't like swallow that battery. Not that our daughters ever swallowed a battery, but like all of these kinds of things that children might try and do as they're exploring the world. And it's so important. And this is something which I'm learning. I'm not like preaching as if I've mastered this, but to give them the room to be able to explore these things, but at the same time giving them the safety to be able to do that as well. And that balance between like not wanting to constantly kind of intervene all the time and just letting them explore is one of the most beautiful things. So I think like fatherhood, I hope, makes people learn as much about themselves as their child is learning about the world. When you think about it in that way, it's mad, because the child is taking in everything. So I think it's a mutual learning process, and you're really making it up as you go along, and you're drawing on all of these different resources from what I was saying of like the dads that might have shared little kind of nuggets of wisdom with me, to my own experience of my father, who was quite a kind of a hands-on kind of caring guy. And yeah, so all of these different things you end up bringing into your parenting. And I think the same goes for mothers in their own way as well. All the different influences they might have had come in various different ways. And in many instances as well, you'll position yourself, you're attempting to kind of tune your own parenting to the things which you might have retrospectively looking back not have appreciated as much from your own childhood. Perhaps there might be things that you'd want to change for yourself and try and enact in your parenting. But to bring it back to, and again, I'm going a bit far from answering a seven-year-old, so I hope the 7-year-old listening is still with me. But just to give an example, many of the dads who had experiences of their fathers being absent were really, or maybe not an everyday presence in their lives. I don't like to use absent because usually they're not entirely like gone. Usually there's some relationship, even if it's a memory, whatever that might be. But those who might not have been that close to their dads, they were really like determined to make sure that they were there for their children. So I think that sometimes as well as fatherhood enables you to kind of correct the wrongs of the previous generation, perhaps, or to attempt to at least. So to answer the 7-year-old, I think it's a very important role, and it changes the world for you, and it's very exciting as well, and it teaches you to be patient and to learn how to adapt. And it's an ongoing thing, like day on day. So one day you'll get it right. If you were keeping like a little journal, like a little book of kind of your parenthood, it would probably look like this. So some days it would be up, and some days it would be like you're tired and you're frustrated and these kind of things. But yeah, it's just important to continually be present. Can't really say more than that.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And I think, yes, it's a great point about that constant improvement through the generations. I think that speaks volumes, especially when you get cases of a man who might not have had a great father, and that's their motivation for being a great father to their son. I think that's quite a beautiful thing. There's another brilliant question about fatherhood that I'll read out. This is from a 15-year-old student in Essex, and it is: my dad's a carer for my mum and also works full-time to support the family. He's under pressure from an old idea of what it means to be a man, and also has to take on housework that was traditionally a female role. Do you think men with mixed roles like this get as much respect as single mothers in society?
That's a powerful question. Thank you to the person who shared it and who's been able to kind of really reflect in quite a deep way about their experiences and the experiences of their dad. So there's two things I think I want to bring out from that question, or two ways that I'd approach responding. So in the first instance, I'd say that care work is so often unmarked and made invisible, and that one of the main things I think that women activists and that feminist activists have been campaigning for a long time is to have care work acknowledged as being work and important, that labour being given value, and work that women have done for many, many generations, like you say, in that more traditional role, has often been kind of not given adequate recognition. And I'd say that although it's different when it's related to masculinity in its own particular ways, I'd say that that caring work amongst men is also often not recognized or often not esteemed in certain ways. And there's often a kind of a mismatch between, like I was saying before, our experiences of how we think a gender should act or behave, or what a male or female should do, and our actual experiences of that. And that can cause a lot of kind of hardship and difficulty when you get that kind of mismatch between the two. And so there's a certain idea that a man should be primarily out of the home, doing very little when he's home in terms of day-to-day work, and then you find yourself in a position where you are doing that all of that caring work. I think that can provide a real challenge, and it can be emotionally really, really difficult and really take a strain. And I think if you're doing both of those two things, I think that I'd imagine tiredness is probably making those things even harder. That's the first way that I'd want to answer that, and just say that inevitably that's going to be a challenge, you know. And I think it's okay to be honest with that, and to say that this is difficult. And that's the kind of the starting point for maybe working through some of those challenges, and kind of, if not resolving some of those contradictions, just being all right with them. And that's something which, whilst I wouldn't compare my own experience to his father, who clearly it sounds like he's got quite a challenging situation, and fair play to him. Like he's a legend from what I can tell, or what little I can work out, as would be a single mum doing the same work, or a mum who's a carer doing that same work. But I would say that even in my own experience, I've had my own kind of notions of of masculinity challenged a little bit. I didn't realize that I probably didn't realize how much my mum, probably as a Black woman who didn't complain about the amount of work that she did for us, or the amount of sacrifice that she made for us, but just kind of got on with it, how much she actually did for me, and how, in a sense, within the household, I might have been privileged in certain ways. And I haven't, well, not even might have, I definitely was. So it's like, and I didn't really appreciate that until now, when I'm parenting and realizing all the work that it takes to raise and look after children. And so I've had to kind of examine my own, and that freed me up then to be able to pursue academic stuff, to be able to do sports, to be able to flourish as a child. She created the conditions to be able to do that. And so now that I've got a kind of a child of my own, I'm starting to realize how much work that actually takes, and that makes me kind of re-examine that little kind of prince mentality that I might have had in the household as a male child, versus the role that I need to play if I'm going to be an equal kind of partner and hold my end when it comes to taking care of our daughter on a day-to-day basis. So those contradictions, I think, are felt by everyone, but will be even more challenging in those circumstances where you're just doing that much more, you know. But I'd say the second way I wanted to answer the question, I know I'm answering in a long way, is that I don't want to see it or I try not to see it as like a zero-sum game between whether men get more recognition or whether women get more recognition, whether mothers get more recognition or whether fathers do. Those challenges are real for both people. And in many instances, mothers' work and mothers' labour still isn't recognised, despite all the songs we might have. Thank you, Mama, for the 9 months you carried me. Despite the fact that insulting someone's mum, as we saw in the Wiley Stormzy beef, is like one of the worst violations you can enact upon a Black man. Despite the fact that there are these many songs which are kind of odes to motherhood, I think that mothers still don't necessarily get all the recognition that they need to. So I don't think we should be beginning to trade off between one and the other. It's more about that kind of ability to appreciate those equal struggles and the challenges that are there, and also to be able to support one another in that work as well, in that work of raising children and of taking care of one another more generally, if it's a spouse that you might be looking after, or whoever. So yeah, thank you. That was it's a really powerful question. I hope that answer can at least provide some food for thought. But yeah, big up your dad as well. And yeah, keep showing him the love that he deserves, so that he can keep showing you that love.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, and I think, yeah, the sort of the society's gender roles definitely factor into it, and I think it is tricky because of the way men are, portrayed in society and the expectations on them of who they're supposed to be. I can understand why in some ways sort of single fathers perhaps elicit less sympathy than mothers, but like Adom says, mothers deserve the recognition too. But I think it's really interesting as well to then segue into that wider conversation about what it even is in the genders that defines a gender, and the next questions really kind of speak to that, and we'll merge kind of two into one because they're quite similar. But yeah, we've got a question from one of the Barbican community ambassadors, and it's essentially, when you see a person, what is it in them that helps you decide whether they are male or female, and what is the most defining characteristic that makes you masculine? And I think that's a really interesting question, because when I think of, just off the cuff, what makes someone masculine or a man, or what society thinks makes someone a man, I can't confidently say those characteristics aren't equally present in a woman, So in terms of like leadership, being strong, being a sort of caregiver, or someone who's a breadwinner, you can't specifically say, well, only a man can do those things, right? What are your thoughts on that, Adom?
So I tend to think, and again, we've got one of these foundational questions, that getting at the root of, like, what does it mean to be male, to be female, and that being male and being female, or performing masculinity, performing femininity, in terms of how you move, how you live, how you speak in the world, is something quite different to being a man and to being a woman. They might be related, but I think they're quite different, and also having a relation to gender which is outside of those binaries, which I think most of us do in complex ways, that we don't fall neatly within a kind of a very discrete category that is kind of super masculine or super feminine at all times, right? We position ourselves differently according to the circumstances we find ourselves in. So I tend to see gender more as like a set of symbols, and we could think about them, as people often do, kind of on a continuum, but kind of shifting on a continuum according to what context you're in. I know that sounds all a little bit kind of theoretical and a bit abstract, but thinking about kind of the symbol of speech, or of a style of walking that might be read as feminine. Like there are many accounts of people who've been attacked for walking in a particular way, which is seen to reside outside of how their gender is read, or how their gender should move. Yeah, so if you're walking in what's seen as kind of a flamboyant, or in quite a, like, what might be considered a queer way, in a place that's hostile to ways of expressing gender outside of those binary norms, then you might be attacked. And so there's a certain symbol, which is how you're walking, which is being read in a certain way, has been given certain meaning, and elicits a particular response in that context, but that will shift across contexts. So if you're moving in a certain way, in a, perhaps if you're moving as a male in a flamboyant and a carefree manner, through Brighton, where I used to live and where I went to uni, then your body might not be read in the same way as if you were doing that in the center of Bristol where I grew up. And a different again to if you did that for a fishing village that I spent time in Dominica. So every society will have its particular ways of reading symbols of gender, and they're rooted in a kind of a hierarchy of how people believe that a particular body should move, a body that's being received as male, a body that's being received as female, and that will kind of shift and be different across different contexts, but that people often have quite set ideas about how people should move and how people should behave in the world. And I've just given the symbol of kind of walking, but it could equally be about styles of dress. It could equally be about ways of speech, about kind of tone of speech. And yeah, like you say, is that these symbols equally, so you were talking about kind of breadwinner role, for instance, equally would be assigned to, if you're honest about it, could be given to male as it could be given to female. But then people still hold on to some quite fixed notions of males that should be the ones who are playing that role, for instance. So I think that perhaps we're becoming increasingly open to the fact that these symbols won't clearly be fixed at all times to particular bodies. So to male bodies, you won't have a single set of characteristics that line up and that should be attached to men, and equally for women. But I think that we constantly have to do that work of kind of reevaluation, and kind of detaching ourselves from the need to constantly police people's gendered behavior. And I think if you do that, I think also at the same time, it's quite liberating for yourself, however you're positioned, because then you probably won't be policing yourself according to the same set of expectations. And so you've got that kind of, like I said, that world of kind of gendered symbols, and you might be able to have a degree more freedom to be able to choose those that work best for you, and or just to accept those that work best for you, or that you kind of use or carry with you as you move around. The question, because it's like so expansive, I guess I've gone off with it into the ether. But I guess what I really want to say is that we can balance our kind of our like gendered assumptions, like the ways that we think men and women should be, versus how they actually are. And I think if we can bring them as close to how people actually are and kind of move in the world without constantly thinking things should be a different way, we'll probably get less anxious about gender, collectively. Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting that what I see in some men who maybe navigate the gender roles slightly more progressively, perhaps, is and maybe something that I've now tried to understand and come to terms with myself, is that, you know, that it is all about this shifting spectrum and how you move in different situations, right? So it's like, we played football against each other not too long ago, and it's like, it's being able to like go into a situation where testosterone levels are high, whether that be in sport, football, or a martial art, where you can engage in something that taps into more traditionally masculine activities, that perhaps in some ways kind of alleviates any anxiety of then dabbling in something that seems more feminine, like yoga or something, right? It's like, it's hard to, in a place where, if you're in an environment where there are some men who are maybe stuck in older ways of being masculine, it's going to be harder for them to show hostility towards a peer who's getting involved in things that they associate with manliness, who then goes and does something slightly feminine, because there's that kind of duality to it, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that ability to kind of move between those different kind of registers of masculinity, I think that is I think it opens up some exciting possibilities, like the fact that, and I don't know. I think that we can also like look like in the case that you were giving, there was like the contrast between like the older notions of masculinity of like previous generations versus kind of more like contemporary ways of expressing, which might be more fluid or might be more like open to like transgression of those more old school ways. So you might be able to, like, young men can wear skinny jeans now, like footballer swag, like skinny jeans and ankles out and eyebrows done and all of that stuff, at the same time as also being able to show aggression and all these kind of different things in their day-to-day life and to really excel in that, you know what I mean? But I think also we can look back into the history or the archive of black masculinity to find some quite powerful examples of men who were able or who found ways to be able to do that. So the dancer Bogle, for example, in Jamaica, where the predominant notions of masculinity would be considered very heteronormative, he was given kind of universal acclaim. There were theories that he might have been gay. People don't really necessarily know, but that wasn't necessarily the point in terms of his gendered expression. His sexuality and his gender were quite different in terms of his dance move. He was the originator of the dance move called the Bogle, but also various different like originating foundational dancehall moves. But he was an incredible dancer, and he had an incredible, again, that word flamboyance, and that wouldn't necessarily be associated with these kind of ideals of masculinity as the kind of the hard-back Jamaican man, but was able to kind of to use a certain playfulness to move beyond that and to transcend it and just be appreciated for his own craft and his own beauty, in a sense. Another example, I'm revisiting Treme, which is like it's like a series made by the same people who did The Wire, and it's all about like the musical traditions in southern United States, in New Orleans, and it's all about these guys who are like one of the characters is like a rebel, like he's like the original old school Mardi Gras Indian, and these guys were real respected in the neighborhood, and they were hard guys, and they would kind of almost in these Mardi Gras parades, they'd fight for kind of territory as these different groups of who would be considered the best Indian chief. And basically they're dressed up in these beautiful plumes of feathers and these bold, bright colors. So they're on the one hand, they're very, very masculine in terms of their claim to territory, in terms of the respect that they gain in the working class Black communities where they live. But on the other hand, the main thing that they're aspiring to be is beautiful, or at least to present that beauty of their craft and of their outfits to the world. And one of the greatest compliments that a chief would give to another chief is to say that he looks pretty, and to say that he's decorated in this incredibly kind of beautiful way. And this tradition of Mardi Gras Indians goes back kind of, I don't know, like a couple of 100 years, you know? And so we can find these kinds of glimpses within history or within these earlier generations of the ability to kind of to push back against or to transcend some of the bounds of gender in certain ways, but exactly in the ways that you say, like being able to balance off these kinds of symbols of kind of dominant masculinity, the ideas of the kind of the hardback man, against these more kind of expressive and more kind of creative and playful ways of being considered kind of beautiful or given value in whatever way, which I think is it holds a lot of potential. And I think that we can sometimes think that is kind of history of masculinity bad, future of masculinity good, and that in many ways there are a lot of kind of difficult and like probably quite toxic habits to shed, but also we can look back into that history and find those glimpses of these really kind of beautiful traditions which can provide inspiration to the future, which means that now you've got kind of those histories of carnival traditions, which means that now within several carnivals around the Caribbean and definitely within Notting Hill, there's definitely more space, I think, for expression across these different world of carnivals now in various different ways. And maybe that comes into the day-to-day culture as well, in terms of being able to play with the kind of the boundaries of masculinity and maybe kind of expand them as well.
100%, yeah. Well, yeah, man. I mean, I'm excited for the future now. I'm hoping, you know, with you leading the line, we'll be on the cusp of some groundbreaking gender movements.
Following you, man. I'm not leading the line. I'm following you.
No, we'll do it together. We'll cross the line together. But yeah, man, thank you for taking part in this, and yeah, I think it's been very insightful, and thanks to those who sent in the questions as well, the thoughtful questions, and I think this conversation about gender, masculinity, is just something that is just gonna have to keep on going, and not to get disheartened at what sometimes seems the slow pace of the progression of the conversation. I think, slowly but surely we'll reach a place where we can understand all of these things a little bit better. But yeah, man, thank you, Adom.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and yeah, just to big up all of the work that Mandem are doing. I think on a kind of a ground level, Elias, you engage in really, really powerful conversations with people, and again, like, I'll come back to a quote of Jay Electronica, because music has been kind of present throughout, like, a lot of the discussions that you have and a lot of the discussions that we've had as well. And he talks about the revolution being about finding a leader inside of yourself. And I think that you've been able to provide spaces for people to really reflect and think about the revolutions that people can lead in their own lives, to transform their own lives, and what the larger ripple effects of that might be in terms of like a broader social change, in terms of a broader transformation of how we understand masculinity, and maybe being able to do that in a more kind of honest way. I know the challenge is ongoing, but like, the work that you're doing can't be commended more in terms of engaging that conversation. And the fact that you've brought this conversation to the Barbican as well, I think provides a really powerful platform to open that to an even wider horizon. So I look forward to the conversations continuing, and yeah, big up to you, your brother, and to all of the work that all of the Mandem family have been doing.
Thank you so much, man. Fingers crossed that we can have public events before too long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure we will eventually. But it's a good.
It's long overdue, man. We need some. I'm missing hugs, man. Missing hugs.
100%. But yeah, man, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the day, and yeah, lovely speaking to you as always, bro.
Hey, you too, bro. Take care, man.
Cool. Peace out.